every time that Hamas does anything, it's usually in response to something that Israel's already doing. So whenever the media covers rocket fire, it's always like, well, rockets were fired and Israel has the right to self-defense, but
Hmm.
nothing is ever talked about what preceded the rockets, because like you just mentioned so accurately, is that the daily life in the occupied West Bank is like daily life on the height of US occupation of Iraq.
Hey, Abby, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
I can. On top of
Wait, does it
which,
sound like I'm on a microphone or on my laptop?
it
Check,
sounds like a
check, check.
mic. It sounds
Great.
good. So I assume that's a
Okay,
mic.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is this the new home studio, the kind of COVID era style setup?
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually just wallpaper, but it kind of looks like it's something better than that. So,
It really does. It looks like there's depth. That's a neat
yeah,
optical
right?
illusion. Yeah. Oh,
I
that's
love it.
wonderful. How are you doing? Have you just gotten back from your trip, or are you in North America now? Where are you located?
I am. I'm in Los Angeles and I'm just trying to fucking hang out here with my kid, relax. It's been a really fucked up week, so I barely slept or ate. So, yeah, just
Yeah.
trying to chill out now, man. What about you?
Um, yeah, same thing about the fucked up week. Um, we were on our side of the Ciliosphere, aka the Twitch world. We actually did a whole bunch of fundraisers for various Palestinian organizations,
That's
um,
incredible.
which was neat. We collectively fundraised over $500,000 already, which is kind of wild. But at the same time, we've obviously been accused of now funding Hamas by a number of different actors, just because we were donating to the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund and Islamic Relief Canada, stuff like that. But yeah, that
No,
was.
that's the danger, man. I mean, that is really hard to actually get money over there, you know?
Hmm.
Um, the Holy Land Foundation, another charity that was based there, the two members that were running it actually are just in prison,
Hmm.
uh, for aiding and abetting terrorism because of just distributing charity there. So it's really sad,
In
you
the
know?
case of Islamic Relief Worldwide, I think their accusation is that they were supporting orphans who were the orphans of Hamas fighters, obviously. But I mean, you know better than anybody that I think, what is it, the average age, 46% of people there happen to be like children. So
Hmm.
that, I mean, if you are going to support orphans in that region, yeah, most likely they could be orphans of a member of Hamas at some point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and it's such a loosely affiliated term because Hamas is the government. And so it's not just like militants, it's like anyone operating different infrastructure projects or healthcare facilities or, things like that. So it just becomes this blanket term that's like, just more about collective punishment than it really is about quote unquote punishing militants.
Hmm. Well, why don't we start with this? Do you want to give everyone just a quick rundown of who you are, what you do, and what you've been doing, I guess, actively in that region recently?
Yeah, my name's Abby Martin. I'm an investigative journalist, host of the Empire Files on YouTube, and the director of a 2019 documentary called Gaza Fights for Freedom. We have a series of videos and a playlist called Reporting from Palestine on our YouTube channel that people can check out. So we've done extensive coverage from the occupied West Bank, but I was actually blocked from getting into Gaza for life. I was told that I was a propagandist and an Iranian agent
Hmm.
from Netanyahu's press office. Yeah, very strange allegation. I'm used to being called a Russian agent or a Venezuelan agent, so that was like out of left field. So then we worked with journalists on the ground there, photojournalists and videographers, and producers who created this incredible footage and gave us the footage to create the documentary that's just absolutely mind blowing. That really just paints a very accurate picture of what the Great March was like. And this is really an incredible thing because it shows you what happens to Palestinians if they peacefully protest in mass, and they were mowed down by sniper fire. Heinous war crimes were committed, just too many to really count. I mean, actually thousands. And we have this all documented in the film, and we hope that it can be used to move the needle eventually to really prosecute Israel and hold them accountable in front of the ICC.
Before we get down to that issue and the details of it, do you feel because I've gotten the sense recently that this is a little bit different in terms of, I guess, maybe public response as well as the political pressure that's coming from that. Like, I think even a year or two ago, the idea of Andrew Yang's political career getting absolutely tanked for saying what you're supposed to say, to be totally honest, right? Like that, like he was towing the line. You're supposed to just show unwavering support for Israel in all their actions. And now he's kind of been firebombed. Do you feel like there is a change, if not tangibly politically, perhaps within public consciousness?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I've lived through many of these assaults on Gaza. Of course, the Great March was another moment that I think public sentiment was pushed to the breaking point, and now we're seeing the result of that bubbling beneath the surface for so many years, where every couple of years when Israel does something this outrageous and inhumane, tens of millions of people, that public consciousness really just spread so rapidly during these moments of assault. And this compounded with what was happening in Jerusalem, or what is happening in Jerusalem, with the violent purges and ethnic cleansing and expulsion of Palestinians from their homes. And you see these videos going viral. So all of this together, I think, has really just put us at a point where we are seeing the beginning of the end. And I really am not saying that lightly. I have never seen this kind of public reaction before. Polls are reflecting this in terms of Democratic voters, Democratic primary candidates during the 2020 field. Look at what Bernie Sanders was saying. I mean, comparing his statements about Israel-Palestine just 4 years prior, it was shocking. And that is a testament to the power of the movement, the strength and resilience of the movement, and being able to mobilize in such huge numbers and really mounting this pressure, not only against people like Bernie, but now you have this contingent of the squad where Cori Bush, unapologetically pro-BDS, that's huge. We have a sitting member of Congress who's a Palestinian herself. You cannot deny her lived experience. You have Ilhan Omar, AOC. They're all out there talking about how Israel's an apartheid state. That's unheard of, and then coupling that with this historic protests and strike across occupied Palestine, all the territories, all the political factions, it didn't matter. Everyone stood together in this fashion that was so incredibly historic. And then you look at what happened in the US and around the world. Unbelievable protests in Dearborn, where Biden, went to basically tout this giant jobs plan. He was met at the tarmac. He was confronted by Rashida Tlaib. And then you had 150,000 people marching in the streets, the largest pro-Palestine demonstration in the history of this country. I mean, it is incredible what's happening. And that is in part why Israel felt the pressure and the need to actually capitulate to this ceasefire. They didn't want to do that. But everything was pointing to the fact that, I mean, they care the most about where public consciousness is at and where public opinion is at. And they knew, I think, at that point, the tide had turned. The narrative is flipped now. They can't control it anymore. And basically all they were doing was just carpet bombing neighborhoods and targeting civilian infrastructure and committing these egregious war crimes on camera. And they were kind of being beat back militarily by Hamas, which hasn't happened in a long time. So all of that, I think, really points to something, a dam has broken, and I think that we're just going to keep pushing from here.
This is going to sound maybe a little flippant in light of how serious everything you just said was, but like their social media profiles too, I think contributed a little bit in how bad they were. Like, did you see half the things they were tweeting out? Like, what is it? All the Dogecoin rockets to represent all the missiles of Hamas and like everything else. I was like, wow, you are blundering this. Yeah. Like, how are you this
Their
bad?
Their PR team is like so unabashed. It's like so crazy. It's like, what the hell? Like, do you realize how this looks for the rest of the world? They're like, what? Like, it's like insane. Or like that one, it looked like some like goth kid. He was just like, we've been spending all night, like we're so sad in these bomb shelters, and we're like so mad and sad. And it was like the official like Israel account. It was just like, what the hell? Like, who's running this shit?
They and Benjamin Netanyahu shared a PragerU video. Don't forget that.
Yeah.
On top of everything else.
Birds of the same feather.
When you say they're pushing back, can you like militarily, can you actually explain that a little bit? Because I mean, just from my vantage point, it looks as if they're just getting utterly devastated. I don't really see Because everything I feel gets fired in the opposite direction, gets shot up by the Iron Dome. And not that I want in either way, like
No, of
casualties,
course
civilian
not.
deaths, or anyone to be hurt. Like obviously not. But I'm just explaining from what I see from like my cozy position here in Canada.
No, absolutely. And I think it is really interesting what's happened now, because the Iron Dome is the self-defense, right? And so when Israel says it has the right to self-defense, one could argue, well, that is a pretty efficient self-defense system that you guys have
Hmm.
in place, and it actually blocks 90 to 90 to 95% of rocket fire. Now, Hamas did something that I don't know if they've done before, which they issued a threat in reaction to the actions of the IDF troops against Al-Aqsa. So this was something where they were leveraging their control actually beyond Gaza and saying we're going to fuck you up essentially, or react. I mean, I don't know about fuck you up, but I mean, react with rockets if you guys continue this violent assault on Sheikh Jarrah and Al-Aqsa Mosque, and they did. I think their capabilities and targeting of rocket fire has increased dramatically over the years. The fact that they are refurbishing actual Israeli munitions that have been dropped on Gaza and actually melting those down and actually using those as rockets. They have way more rockets than Israel knew, I
Mm.
think, going into this. And the rockets hit around 150 different buildings, started a massive fire within Israel. They hit Jerusalem. I mean, this is kind of an unprecedented thing because usually rockets don't do very much damage at all, and they don't usually kill people. Uh, very few Israelis have been killed by rocket fire in the past, I don't know, 15 years, ever since Gaza was besieged and Hamas, started firing them. So it is very surprising, I think, this time that, you know, over 10 Israelis were killed and 150 locations were hit. And that was a huge embarrassment and also a crisis for Israel because you see these videos of people on the beach. I'm not sure exactly where it is, but I mean, they did not think that they were in danger at all. And you can see the hysteria, kind of happening real time where the sirens were going off and people were hiding in bomb shelters. I mean, this was a political crisis for Israel because not only could they not really explain why, all of these buildings were getting hit and why Hamas had more efficient capabilities than they had before, but also like their residents were just kind of in these bomb shelters day to day. And that was also mounting pressure within Israeli society that they wanted some sort of solution. And that is a success in the eyes of Hamas. I think this is why you see a lot of Palestinians celebrating that they feel like they had some leverage here, even though, of course, there was devastating and catastrophic bombing
Yeah,
on
it
behalf
just
of
feels so
Israel.
disproportionate.
Mhm.
Like, I mean,
Of course,
it
of
always
course it is.
it always does. But I guess you're saying that there is justification on the part of like the Israeli government to say that we are also being attacked in real time. We are like they are directly firing upon Jerusalem, for example.
Well, I think that, I mean, I don't know if I would give the Israeli government justification to do anything it does because
No,
I
no,
think
sorry,
that
yeah, yeah, yeah.
self-defense, yeah, 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 but I know what you're saying. It's like the self-defense is the Iron Dome, but then the fact that they're carpet bombing these neighborhoods and targeting all of these, apartment buildings and hospitals and actual trauma doctors and journalists and just, leveling just compounds of civilian infrastructure, refugee camps, like all of those things are war crimes, and
Yeah.
all of those things are completely unnecessary, and obviously were done to collectively punish the entirety of the population in Gaza. I don't think any of that's justified, but of course, I think that the fact that Hamas is now has better military capabilities and it shows that there is, that Israel can't just do this anymore. They are going to, basically what I'm trying to say is that Israel knows that they can't fight Hamas one on one. They can't fight Hezbollah one on one. This is why they do these aerial massacres from the sky. Because if they were to
Mm-hmm.
invade the Gaza Strip like they threatened to do a couple days ago, they would get fucked up, just
Mm-hmm.
like they did in 2014. So the only thing that they really can do is bomb people like cowards from the sky, where the majority of people dying are civilians and children, which is just absolutely horrifying. But I think what's different in terms of this round is that the pressure not only from the international community, but I think Hamas itself, like, really positioned itself as an entity that is stronger than Israel, and Israel just completely underestimated, I think, what Hamas could do to them. And
Mm-hmm.
that's something that they need to consider moving forward, because when you have that capability in this besieged medieval, like, when you're putting this medieval siege on a population, they're still able to generate this kind of armed resistance. Like, that's an interesting factor to consider
Mm-hmm.
moving forward, because it doesn't matter what Israel's doing, these people are still going to be able to resist them. And that's kind of crazy.
When you say you feel that it may be coming close to an end, what do you mean specifically by that? Because to me, while I do completely agree with you that there's a massive change, like the Overton window has shifted so much. Like I was canceled a year ago for saying that what they do there is tantamount to genocide. I didn't even use the term genocide.
Mm-hmm.
Now Andrew Yang supports genocide was a top trending hashtag, right? So I totally agree that shifted, but at the same time, Joe Biden is pushing forward this $735 million military support immediately. And the pushback on that is effectively just Sanders and the squad kind of thing. So how is this moving forward, and how is it ultimately going to end, do you see?
I think that it's the beginning of the end in terms of they can't control the narrative anymore. And so at this point, moving forward, it's just about enough public pressure being mounted. And so I think if you look 10 years ago, like, the issue, even like you said, I mean, Andrew Yang during the Democratic primary, he didn't even really have to, like, say anything. And now, just a couple years later, he is really getting heat, rightfully so, because of his horrific comments that,
Mm-hmm.
and I
Read
love
the
that. I mean,
room.
it really
Yeah.
shows you, like, you can't have that pro-Israel position anymore and even remotely consider yourself liberal or progressive. I don't even know if Andrew Yang does consider himself that. I feel like he's more like a libertarian, but
Tech bro.
um yeah, and, like, what happened to the UBI? I thought, like, all of this shit's been watered down so much since he
Mm-hmm.
started. He just wants power.
Yeah.
Like, he's just a fucking charlatan, you know?
Yeah.
But to your point, I mean, yes, it does seem like US politicians are unmovable on
Mm-hmm.
this issue. But that is not true, because change never comes from the top down. It has to come from the grassroots. And if you look at, like, progressive spaces in the US, you cannot enter them. You cannot stand side by side in any of these communities that are fighting these issues in the US, at least, without being unabashedly pro-Palestine. You
Mm-hmm.
have to kind of agree with that in order to be a progressive, right? There's this issue of progressive except for Palestine is not a tenable one anymore. And if you look 10 years ago, it was almost the opposite. It was too controversial to be pro-Palestine if you're talking about the liberation of somewhere like Iraq, and mixing those messages together. I feel like people were shunned and pushed out of the space and said, no, like, we don't want to isolate or ostracize people. Now you can't do that anymore. So that's different. Polling the Democratic field of voters, that's different. Now the majority of Democrats say we need to pressure Israel as opposed to Palestine, which is a huge thing. The fact that we have that contingent of the squad, the fact that there's actual sitting Congress people signing on to leverage aid for Israel to adhere to international law, all of those things put together shows you that we are on the right path. The fact that the ICC is now saying that they are moving forward with investigating.
Oh no, I think we lost her. Abby?
Hey, sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
Oh, no worries. I thought the CIA got you.
The Mossad shut us down, dude.
Yeah.
But I mean, just to sum it up, like, I think
Yeah.
all of you can't turn back the clock with all of these organizations, declaring that this is an apartheid state, and all we can do now is move forward with what can we do about it. And that's why Israel has gone on the offense to actually pass these anti-BDS measures all across the country. You have 30 or so states that have anti-BDS measures, which essentially make Americans pledge that they will never boycott Israel in order to work
Mm-hmm.
in these states. And I'm suing Georgia over one of these bills right now. But I do think that even though politicians like Biden are so horrifically disappointing, and really he is just as complicit as Netanyahu for every child that's died, and all the blood is on his hands.
Oh,
But
same with
even
Justin
Biden,
Trudeau. I mean, every
oh my
every NATO
God.
ally is taking part. Yeah.
Oh my God, yeah, it's horrific. It's horrific. But I do think even Biden was feeling the pressure, and that's why he said to Netanyahu, he said, "You need to find a solution to this because
Mhm.
I can't take the pressure anymore." And he was talking about all of those things that I mentioned, and that's a huge breakthrough moment for pro-Palestine solidarity around the world, and it can only get better from here.
In the events that took place in, say, like the last really bad conflict, maybe 2014, right? Um, was the conditions that brought about the ceasefire in that instance dramatically different from now?
Yeah, well, actually not dramatically different because it was Israel getting fucked up, because they actually did invade in the Gaza Strip, and they again completely underestimated Hamas's capabilities to target them. Like once they were on the ground in there, and this is why they didn't do it this time around, is because a lot of them were killed. A lot of the soldiers that went in there were killed. And I think that, Hamas does get aid and help from Hezbollah and other countries that are, deemed U.S. enemies that are helping train and arm Hamas and Hezbollah fighters and stuff like that. And they they have they have a lot of strength, actually a lot more than I think Israel assessed this time around and last time around, which is why you see them just cowardly, hiding behind these huge bombing campaigns.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, 2014, I think, was a pivotal moment because they realized that they can't fight these people, in front of them, and that's why they don't know what to do next. But yeah, that's why I think they capitulated to this ceasefire. But of course, both sides are saying it was a win for them.
Yeah, of course. I was gonna say though, isn't this kind of just the perpetual cycle that we're used to, where this is gonna happen? There'll be a ceasefire, and then there'll be an increase in the amount of people getting evicted forcibly from their homes. At which point, Hamas will do something horrifying, like do a suicide bombing or target a building or something like that. At which point, that justifies Israel to do an overwhelmingly disproportionate slaughter and bombing campaign, and then the world reacts. They fire back and forth. They do a ceasefire, and we continue. And
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, this is what people think of as a vicious cycle, but I think that there's a couple points that need to be made. A is that uh, Gaza is a warehouse of refugees that Israel continues to deport people to that it deems criminals. These people cannot leave. There's 2 million people living there. 75% of them are refugees that were ethnically cleansed from their lands, like right outside of this artificial border fence. There's a shoot to kill policy if people get too close to this fence.
oh wow.
Water, electricity, mobility, like basic human mobility, all of those things are controlled by the Israeli government or the hostile military entity in terms of the Egyptian border, and they work in collaboration with the Israelis. Under these conditions, these abysmal living conditions, you have to understand that people will resist that, and
Yeah,
and
of
actually
course.
under the Geneva Conventions, they do have the right to resist, and occupied people do have the right to resist, and it actually says, the clause says, quote, particularly armed struggle, end quote. So that's something to consider when we look at what is painted often as a vicious kind of cycle that's never ending, and it's this warring conflict over religion. It's a tale as old as time. I think that if the siege were lifted and basic humanity was restored to the people living in Gaza, I think that we would see things dramatically shift. But yeah, I mean, every time that Hamas does anything, it's usually in response to something that Israel's already doing. So whenever the media covers rocket fire, it's always like, well, rockets were fired and Israel has the right to self-defense, but
Hmm.
nothing is ever talked about what preceded the rockets, because like you just mentioned so accurately, is that the daily life in the occupied West Bank is like daily life on the height of US occupation of Iraq. I mean, this isn't just like, we don't just call this area occupied because there's like an Israeli military base or soldiers milling around. Like, this is like a really, really devastating military occupation that prohibits people from protesting, waving Palestinian flags. You can't pass out political literature. You have checkpoints that are completely dehumanizing and humiliating and that make your life fucking hard in every sense of the word. Hours on your commute, they blockade your neighborhood. You have to like It's insane. Spraying chemically enhanced like sewage water all in through your home, raiding the refugee camps, tear gassing people, throwing skunk bombs and stun grenades. Like all of those things really are daily life. The demolitions, right? The armed extremist settlers that are committing pogroms across East Jerusalem and West Bank. Those things continue every day. And that's aided and abetted by the Israeli state. So everyone kind of looks to Hamas and Gaza and they just say, oh, well, Gaza and it's a war between Hamas and Israel, right? But really, like the war continues every single day and it will continue beyond the ceasefire. And that's why we need to stay outraged, and not take a breath because this fight continues and Palestinians are still suffering until they're liberated. Like this is not going to end.
Mm-hmm. In your recent documentary, the footage that's kind of going viral is you've interviewed a bunch of people in Jerusalem, I think, or was it in Jerusalem?
Yeah.
And there seems to be an undercurrent of people being completely accepting of genocide in ways, or ethnic cleansing, if you will, right? Almost talking about it as if it's a necessity, like we have to purge the Palestinians from this area. What do you think is contributing to that normalization of that mentality, and B, what can be done to combat it?
And before I say anything, love your shirt, man.
Oh,
Michael
yeah,
Brooks,
awesome.
such a great one, dude.
Yeah.
Really,
Oh,
really miss
the
that guy.
goat,
And this
the
whole
absolute
thing,
goat.
I just kept thinking he would be so good, and he's so fucking missed right now. What is contributing to the fascist rise of Israeli society? Well, the entire foundation of Israel is a settler colonial state. The mentality to be a Zionist and even a liberal Zionist is that you have to be okay with the colonial nature of what Israel is, which is not only the fact that it was created on top of another people's and required ethnic cleansing in order to found the state of Israel, just like America and Canada.
Mm-hmm.
But moreover, it's that it's ongoing. So this is a continuous mass expulsion. Like, for example, there's a
Like
law called the
Canada.
demographic law. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. It's basically an extension of U.S. and Canadian settler colonial mentality,
Mm-hmm.
and like, especially because Canada and the Canada is the U.S.'s junior collaborator with the war on terrorism and has done horrific things. And that I think that's why Israelis were so quick to just talk to me on camera because they look at America and they're like, you guys get it? Like you guys are engaged in this war on terrorism, this war against Muslims around the world. Like, fuck them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's kill them all.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get them all off of our land.
Mm-hmm.
You guys agree with that, right? And I think that in part, like they think that we empathize with their plight. They also know that the U.S., of course, is the staunch ally with them and subsidizes so much of their militarism. But that mentality is so prevalent and it's such a huge current that I would argue is very mainstream in Israeli society because, and it has been getting worse. There used to be a kind of feasibility for a peace process. The Oslo Accords was supposed to be the establishment of the Palestinian state, and Israel has just flagrantly violated international law ever since that moment and atomized the entire West Bank with settlements. But in order to be a Zionist, in order to live in that society, you need to be okay with the occupation. And even I've talked to many people who say that they consider themselves leftists or liberal Zionists, and they are okay with the occupation. They just said it's too inhumane. It needs to be more humane. But they're okay with the fact that 5 million Palestinians are subjugated in this way. And that is very disturbing because you need to maintain Gaza. According to these people, you need to maintain like the terrorist threat, quote unquote, right? And then you also need to continuously subjugate the other people remaining in the West Bank and be okay with the expansion of settlements because that's what Israel is. I mean, it's a settler colonial state that's necessitates the ongoing ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population. And that continues every single day. Of course, there are anti-Zionists. Of course, there are people on the left that don't agree with it, but I would argue they are too few to actually make a difference and pull this fascistic reign backward because it's just getting worse every single time Israel goes on some sort of offensive, like we just saw, Netanyahu's poll numbers shoot through the roof.
Hmm.
And you could argue, actually, this is why he did what he did, is actually to generate more support because he's facing these corruption, charges, and he could potentially go to prison
Oh,
for
in the middle
doing all this
of
shit.
what was it?
Yeah.
Another government was forming, and they were
Yeah.
forming with the coalition, like an Arab coalition, and immediately that's no longer a thing. I mean, the political opportunism is absolutely horrifying in this case.
Absolutely.
Okay, so one quick thing I wanted to ask you about, because you
Hmm.
brought up obviously the legend Michael Brooks, one of many incredible, prominent Jewish Americans who are speaking out against this, and obviously there's been an amazing groundswell of that as well in America, which is being pushed up against by, I guess, the right, who have tried to conflate anyone who is against the Israeli government as being anti-Semitic by their very nature. In terms of, you said that there's a very prominent change in like the just the way we're talking about this, the Overton window, all that kind of stuff being moved. Is there enough of a change in that respect? Where do you think people have finally been able to separate that Republican conservative idealism, that if you are anti-Israeli in any way, shape, or form, you're also anti-Zionist?
It's a good point. I think that, the Republicans, we have a long way to go in terms of having people see clearly, I think, the logic behind that. Because, I would argue that a lot of Republicans kind of don't care about people outside of this country anyway. But so I feel like liberals are the ones that we need to really get on board, and Democrats in general, because there is this conditioning that we share with Israeli society. You asked, how are Israelis kind of this quick to endorse ethnic cleansing and genocide? It is from birth, the cradle to the IDF, which everyone needs to serve in the Israeli military if you live in that society. That is a heavy indoctrination and plus forced segregation from the Palestinians living in these territories. There's like huge signs that are posted by the Israeli government that says, like, do not enter or you'll die. Like, in threat of your life, you can't enter, and you can't, go and speak to these people. I mean, it really is just very an extreme society in that regard. But in terms of liberals and the Jewish community, like, this is another kind of great sign of how things are dramatically shifting. The fact that anti-Zionist Jewish people are at the forefront of,
Hmm.
walking off birthright, confronting these organizations, standing up for Palestinians, and being such incredible voices in that regard to say Zionism does not represent Judaism. You cannot conflate this. It is absolutely horrific that the Israeli government has done this and basically weaponized this very real and growing threat of anti-Semitism, which is absolutely dangerous and needs to be reckoned with. The fact that Israel has weaponized this term and actually used it to go after Palestinian activists and like SJP chapters on campus is like so awful, right? Because it's rerouting all of these resources and energy toward attacking Palestinian students instead of like actual anti-Semitic, like Nazis
Hmm.
that we know are like really like this is a really dangerous thing. And I think Trumpism really showed you like how many of these people came out of the shadows, and that is a very growing threat across the continent. But of course, all of this becomes obfuscated and clouded in this notion that if you are criticizing the Israeli government for atrocities, then you are anti-Semitic. And we need to flip that narrative and put them on the offense. I'm sorry, them on the defense instead of us, to say you need to explain yourself about why you're committing war crimes. It's not us that has to explain why we're not anti-Semitic for criticizing a government, right?
Hmm.
But it's just so perfect, actually, when you see that this is the strategy to make progressives and liberals feel like they are bigots
Yeah.
and racists, because that's horribly offensive to people who are staunch anti-racists like you and me. I mean, so that's something that I think is also like not working anymore. But yeah, I mean, the anti-Zionist Jewish organizations, they are really, they are driving this point home for everyone because they're just saying you can't do this anymore because we're Jewish and we don't stand for this.
Hmm.
And that's making a big impact.
No, that's really good to hear. Um, I got a softball for you. How do we achieve a two-state or one-state solution?
Yeah, this is a huge question. And if you look back at what the peace process resulted in terms of the Oslo Accords, this was positioned as the 1967 borders. Israel went on a huge military offense in 1967, and that's when they seized the West Bank and Gaza and put them under Israeli martial law. And right now, of course, the West Bank is still under that military control. So the Oslo Peace Accords were supposed to carve out that Palestinian territory for the future Palestinian state, which could have been a feasible thing. But the settlements continued unabated from that point forward. And so here we are decades later where the West Bank itself, and I actually didn't even understand this until I went there. I thought, there could be a second state. I didn't really understand the situation until I went to the West Bank and traveled between these areas that are supposed to be for Palestinians. It's compartmentalized into three different parts: Area A, B, and C. Area A is under entirely Palestinian control, and it's only 17% of the West Bank. The rest of the West Bank is under Israeli military control, and all of the settlements have effectively made it so that you can't even create that land for Palestinians because you'd have to go from one point to the other, crossing Israeli settlements and checkpoints. You know what I mean? So that's why you had like Bernie Sanders during the campaign say, we need to adhere to international law and withdraw settlements to the 1967 borders because that's international law. Like all of these settlements are illegal
Hmm.
in the eyes of the international community. And so in order for this feasibility of like a second state, all of these settlements need to be withdrawn back to those original borders. I don't think that's going to happen. And I think Palestinians, I think it's up to Palestinians ultimately, like what they want and what the goal is in terms of the political victory. Because I've met many Palestinians who said that they will accept the 1967 borders of the second Palestinian state. And I've heard many Palestinians say that they just want to dissolve the apartheid state and have one person, one vote where things are at right now. Like they don't care about that. They just want democracy and they want peace and they want the occupation to end. In my eyes, I think that that might be a closer achievable goal, is dissolving apartheid, right? Lifting the occupation, lifting the siege, and actually giving people democratic rights. It doesn't sound too radical of a notion, but
Hmm.
when you pose it in the way that the Israeli lobby has and the US political establishment, it makes it seem like people are actually calling, like when you say, oh, Israel doesn't have the right to exist, you're calling to exterminate Jews and expel them all. No, of course not. That's insane. No, no one's calling for that. Everyone's just saying, everyone just live in harmony and peace right now. Like,
Yeah, of course. I think that, well,
dissolve this regime.
I mean, maybe the problem there would be the messaging itself, because I have seen people say like abolish Israel, like just outright,
Yeah,
right?
right, right.
And to me, I was like, well, yeah, that does, like, that just comes across as not only like anti-Semitic, but just basically like there's no way to say or hear something like that without conflating like abolish Jewish people or something, right? Like I
Right,
think I would completely agree with you. I think there has to be a situation in which they have a right to exist, but it's just as of now, Palestinians don't, or at
right.
least it feels that way.
Exactly.
Yeah. Uh,
Exactly.
um,
Exactly. Everyone should have the right to exist there, and everyone should have the same equal rights.
mhm. How does it, like the borders themselves? You were just saying, like, if we got back to the Oslo Accords,
Hmm.
it's still so it looks like peppered when I see the
Hmm.
actual, like the way the roads have been built in certain
Hmm.
areas, right? And the way they're just like, I just can't in my right mind see how this could be separated into two separate countries independent of each other when they're so interwoven with each other. Like what is the,
Exactly.
yeah, what's the solution to
Exact.
that
That's
then?
that's the huge problem, man. I mean that's what I can't wrap my mind around it because Gaza's over here and it's this
Yeah,
tiny strip of land, and then you have the West Bank, which is
bank.
completely like speckled different land that's already taken over, and then you have Jerusalem,
Hmm.
which is supposed to be this shared city because it has such an incredible religious significance for
To both
Christians,
sides.
Muslims, and
Yeah,
Jews.
yeah, yeah.
And you're right. It's like, how do you do that? That's why, like, in my eyes, I feel like the only solution is like a one democratic state,
Hmm.
and
In
I,
which everyone has
yeah,
equal
yeah,
rights and say.
and to just share that space and land. And there's so many hundreds of miles of like arable land that aren't taken over by settlements and stuff from in within Israel, within the 48 borders. And that's why it's so interesting that settlers continue to go on top of Arab villages I think we know why, but it's like you could just move where there is like huge open spaces. You don't have to move on top of a Palestinian village
Hmm.
and take it over. But I think that's exactly the point.
But could you ever like when I hear the idea of the one state solution, what always troubles me is that technically that's what we have right now, and under that one state solution, Israel is showing itself to be like grossly unable to not act within imposing a different standard of living between humans, in essence, right? To put it raw. So how do we have a situation in which we have a one state solution, but everyone is equal under the eyes of both the law? They have equal voting rights. They have equal, ability to travel. They're not seen as second class citizens. Like, how do we get down that pathway if we are going for a one state solution? Is it still going to be called Israel? Would it be called like New
Right.
Jerusalem or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. I mean, I think that we just have to look at what happened with South Africa as an
Hmm.
example, and that South Africa exists today. I've been there. It is still racist society. I mean, you can't change that in a generation.
Yeah.
It is very like you can feel it and you can feel the tension still. And the white people there are still, living in like very gated, protected communities, and there's still a lot of shanty towns for the black populations, and it is not, it's definitely not like a fucking paradise
They
for
still own the
everyone.
majority of the wealth and the farms and everything,
Hmm.
don't they? The white people do.
Yeah. Yes. And so like, but at the same time, it's like it exists, and and racism, it's not an institutionalized thing anymore in terms of like the government, doing this itself because of the pressure from the international community. And we didn't have to wait till racist white people in South Africa finally had a change of heart. I
Hmm.
think that we all knew that that was never going to happen. And the U.S. was one of the last entities to support the liberation of Black people in South Africa. I mean that took an extreme amount of pressure and isolation from the international community. I do not know what the one state solution would look like. I don't know what it would be called. I think that we, as like a white ally living in the heart of the empire, I just know that the burden lays on my shoulders because I'm an American citizen and my government is subsidizing
Hmm.
this apartheid regime, with my tax dollars, $10 million every single day. And so I need to do whatever I can to follow the lead of Palestinians who are saying that we need that BDS campaign to be mounted in the same way that apartheid fell in South Africa. And I think that there needs to be a lot more articulated about how that will look and what will happen if that pressure is finally at a breaking point where
Hmm.
Israel does finally capitulate. I think it has to happen, of course, here, because the US is the most important military partner and political partner for Israel. But once it finally does mount here, and once Americans finally do provide that resistance and make it untenable for our politicians to not take a harsh stand, then we need to have people explain, and follow that lead. But yeah, I don't have the answers to that, and I wish I did. But I would say that that's for the Palestinian community to figure out, as
Oh
well
yeah,
as
that's
the as remaining Israelis. Like you said, like everyone there living there needs to work together to figure out how that can actually work in a legal, fair, just, humane way.
Oh, that's totally why I was joking when I said this is a softball question. Like like how can anyone ever be like, oh, okay, well yeah, here's the solution to one of the most complicated geopolitical problems of our lifetime, So here we go. I know you said you only had about 45 minutes. I just
I have
realized.
I have 10 more
Okay,
if you
10
want.
more.
Yeah.
Can Are you allowed to talk? This is going to be totally unrelated. Are you allowed to talk at all about the RT fiasco? Is that something you're on, like
Oh,
non-disclosure
sure.
agreements?
No, I'm
Okay.
not on disclosure.
Okay, I heard a rumor. Tell me if this is true.
Yeah.
That you left because they would not let you be critical of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
So, do you have like 5 minutes for a really crazy story?
Yes, obviously.
Okay. So I was at a show called Breaking the Set. Of course, as a vociferous like opponent of U.S. imperialism, I was speaking every single day about, my government and the crimes that it was committing and all of these things. This was like the height of, it was 2012. So Obama was president. It was very disappointing seeing him not do anything that he wanted to do, but et cetera, et cetera. About a year or two, maybe 2 years into the show, that's when Russia had started to fortify its military buildup on the border of Ukraine. It was a very intense situation because the media propaganda was very contrasted. You had the US media literally showing like Russia was about to launch a war. Like you couldn't deny the footage, right? There's like
Hmm.
like tons of tanks on the border, soldiers like armed to the teeth. I was just like, what the fuck is going on? Then you had Russia Today. It was the first time that I felt like the network was being, it's a Russian state television network. Of
Yep.
course, they are going to utilize a geopolitical crisis for their benefit. And so, what Russia Today was putting out was kind of similar to how the U.S. corporate media was showing, like the U.S. invasion of Iraq at the very beginning, where soldiers were being greeted with candy and flowers.
Yeah.
And that's what. So I was like looking at these two different images, and I was like, "This is insane." I don't claim to be an expert on the situation, but I know that I don't agree with what my network is showing right now because I felt like there was no nuance and I didn't agree with it. And so I actually went and talked to my boss in the morning and I said, I'm going to say this statement. And if you don't want me to say it, I'm going to quit. And he was like, all right. He's like, read the statement,
Hmm.
and so I went out on air that night and I read the fact that I was my own person and I was paving my own editorial freedom at the network and I didn't agree with what was going on. That statement went viral. In like one day I was painted as like this anti-Russian hero in the Western media. It was actually hilarious because I was just being used and trotted around as like a anti-Russia puppet
Hmm.
by all of these entities that I actually like hate and critique every day, and to see myself as the source of this 24-hour media cycle and to be like used as a talking point to demonize Russia, I found fascinating. But here's the real fascinating part about it. I actually, because it paved such an international story, I was able to stay at the network. And I told them, I was like, look, this is actually really good. You want people to criticize Russia on the network, right? Like this
Yeah.
this would be insane if you actually got mad at me for doing this. This should be a breaking moment for RT to actually prove its legitimacy as
Yep.
not just a propaganda organ for Russia. And so there was actually mixed messages. Some people in Moscow loved it and said, keep going. Like, you're right. This is good. And some people were very mad, like put RT under fire. It was like a very kind of controversial moment. But here's what kind of fucked it all up and really convoluted the whole thing is I had a colleague named Liz Wall who was a total apolitical moron who literally just like read, she was just like a fucking talking head, just read the prompter and had no opinions at all.
Hmm.
At the same time, Bill Crystal, this is like a very fucking fascinating insight on how DC operates, but Bill Crystal, who's a total neocon warmonger participant in the Iraq War,
Oh
he
yeah.
ran a think tank. And one of the people at his think tanks was like his minion, this guy named Jamie Kirchick. So 2 days after my shit got viral and it was like this huge story, but I had continued to be like, I'm going to stay at Russia Today and continue to prove that I have the freedom to speak about Russia. And I'm going to continue to do that. 2 days later, my colleague Liz Wall like quit live on air, like went out on her anchor desk and was like, this
Oh
is a
damn.
propaganda network. They won't let me do anything. I'm going to quit. Then it came out. And then she went on all of these like mainstream media shows and threw me under the bus and was like, Abby's this crazy conspiracy theorist. You shouldn't trust her. She was like, I'm like the real dissident. I'm the one who's this and that. And then and then what came out, what was exposed is that her whole quitting was actually a stage managed operation by this neoconservative think tank that was run by Bill Crystal. It was fucking fascinating. Like she
No way.
went around with this guy, Jamie Kirchick, and he propped her up to be like, to basically delegitimize what I did and make it seem like no, Abby's crazy, but this girl's the real dissident against the RT. It was an insane thing, and it really it was a completely concocted like psyop. It was bizarre, but anyway, the reason that I
Did
quit it was actually a year later because I just my boss never really forgave me for what happened, even though he let me do whatever I wanted after that.
okay. So it turned out they were in fact just a state propaganda network.
Yeah, look, RT is horrible now. I love Lee
Yeah.
Camp and I love Chris Hedges, and I think that they know that they have to be hands off with them. But like, RT has become, it's so weird. Like they became a cartoonish depiction of what the actual intelligence community was claiming that they were. Like they became just essentially a pro-Trump network. And it is so disappointing because when I was there, I felt like I did. I mean, I was able to do whatever I wanted and I asserted my independent and editorial freedom there, which I feel like is a lot more than what other people can do at other outlets. You know, we've seen people get fired over just criticizing the Iraq war, stuff like that. Cenk Uygur got fired from MSNBC for criticizing Obama.
Hmm.
So the fact that I actually did risk my job to say, I'm going to do this, and if you don't like it, I'm going to quit. And the fact that they let me do it, I think does speak to the fact that people don't do that enough. Like, I don't know if they just don't care enough or like don't put enough on the table to risk, but like I was able to do that at RT. I feel like people could try to do that and make a, make a big thing out of it at other places if they really wanted to. But as far as where RT's at now, it's trash, dude. It's a horror. It's absolutely sad what it's become. It's like basically like Zero Hedge. Like what it's just insane. It's crazy because it used to be really solid and really like filling that void. The reason RT was so viral back then is because it filled the void of what corporate media was failing. And it really had shows like mine where I was just, all I did was just uplift and provide a space for people who were, not included in the mainstream media narrative about a ton of stuff. But
Yeah, could you answer this one question though? Because my
yeah.
impression, because I used to watch you on RT back in the day when I was younger, was always that you and everyone else who was an American working for that network had the ability to do what you wanted because what you wanted to do was report on anti-imperial perspectives, right? And they gave you that, but they were giving that to you because it helped their bottom line, which would be anti-Americanism. Is that a fair assessment?
I mean, I think that of course every single network is propaganda, right? I
Hmm.
think that you can argue that a lot of the corporate media is propaganda. A lot of it has very controversial and questionable funding. What of course RT looked for people that helped their narrative. Like their narrative was basically providing the space that wasn't being provided from the mainstream media, and that's exactly why it basically like it's the same thing as like when people are like, well, why do no journalists in like the New York Times or the Washington Post, like why isn't anyone pro-Palestinian? And it's
Yeah.
like, well, why do you think that they get hired?
Yeah.
Like they don't get hired and then they are told by the network like you can't do this or you'll get fired. No, it's like it's not only self-censorship. I think it's beyond that. It's that you have a willing obedience for the worldview, like the orthodoxy that's put out by these publications, right? So like people are becoming journalists at these networks because they believe in American exceptionalism. They're Zionists. They're this and that. Like I'll never forget when the Parkland students were like confronting Marco Rubio about him taking money from the NRA, and he was like, you have it the other way around. He's like, the NRA gives me money because I have my position already on guns.
Hmm.
Like if I stop taking NRA money, I'm not going to like change my position. That's not
Hmm.
what's
It's
influencing me.
it's
So I
it's
think
not
it's like the same
bribes.
thing. You know what I mean? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
exactly. It's the same thing. It's like, yeah, of course. Like I wasn't told to do anything by RT. And the second that I felt like I was like on this weird propaganda thing, I did what I did. But obviously I was a useful person for the network, for this mantra of like questioning mainstream media narratives and all of that. But yeah, no, it absolutely is that way, you
yeah.
know?
Can I ask you one final question that chat's been asking
Yeah,
me, dying to ask you? Do you have a tattoo of an ice cream cone? That's what they've been
I
asking me.
do.
And
You
what's
see
the
it?
story
I
behind it?
do. I have a bunch of tattoos from this woman, Alex Strangler. She's such a cute little like tattoo artist here. She has the best fucking stuff, and I just like let her just do it because she's so amazing. I have a giant tattoo on my leg from her. Really cute stuff. Definitely check her out. But yeah, I don't know. I got it on my wrist, and I just love it. It's super cute.
They're asking
But
what flavor it is.
it is sprinkles because sprinkles are my favorite. I have to have sprinkles on all of my ice cream, so it's strawberry vanilla with sprinkles and a cherry on top
Oh, nice.
with the waffle cone,
Uh,
of course.
Abby, do you wanna plug your amazing work so everyone can find you?
Yeah, I would just encourage people, do not get complacent here. Like I think everyone who is progressive and everyone who's obviously a part of your community is outraged rightfully at
Yeah.
what we just saw take place, and rightfully outraged by the complicity and complacency of the US political establishment as well as the Canadian political establishment and the media at large for what happened. And we can't forget that no matter what happens next. Like the ceasefire is a great pause in the violence, but it doesn't mean that all of the occupation and all of those daily things that Palestinians suffer under are going to stop. And that we just have to stay in the struggle. We have to stay in the struggle and we have to stay in the fight. And that means just spreading consciousness, spreading awareness. This is a very opportune time because people's interests are peaked again. So this is when we need to really take a step back and learn as much as we can, because we need to be the conduits and the vehicles to spread that to everyone we know. Because really, above all, this is a political education issue, and that goes beyond Israel Palestine. That's everything, as we know. Like, we are morbidly misinformed about so much and why things are the way they are. And that's why I do the Empire Files. This is a show that's trying to look at all issues through the lens of the US military machine, why we can't have nice things here in the US because we are squandering every single cent to subjugate and oppress millions of people around the world. And so I encourage people to check out our show on the Empire Files on YouTube, and our movie, Gaza Fights for Freedom. We just put it up for free. Please check it out before YouTube takes it down. It's already being throttled. You have to go through like several layers of security protocols to watch it. I promise you it's worth it. You could actually bypass that if you go to Films for Action. You can check out our movie on there. You can go to GazaFightsForFreedom.com to watch it in Arabic or Spanish. Thank you. Thank you for caring about this issue. Thank you for giving me the space to talk about it. It's been really fun, and I appreciate your work. I just found out about you a couple months ago, and I think you're great. And so it's been cool to come on here. I hope to come on again.
I am almost curious what someone sent you, because so much of what I do is dumpster fire, like comedy bullshit. So I was like,
I mean, I just see your takes on Twitter, and I've just
okay.
noticed you in that way, like chiming in. I'm like, all right, this dude's. I like
Cool.
what this guy has to say. So
Giddy up. That's awesome.
But no, I need to be getting more into Twitch. I'm new to the whole Twitch universe, so this is a new thing for me.
Twitch is really cool in the sense that like all the tools that they developed for gamers to basically antagonize each other, you can use to spread like lefty kind of praxis and theory and stuff. Well, like you can raid into another small streamer and then send a whole bunch of audience their way, right? Or you can host them when you're not streaming. Like, it's cool. It's been
awesome.
neat to see that stuff work that way. Yeah, you should become a Twitch streamer, Abby. Everyone will love you for it. Yeah.
I just want to play old school Nintendo though. I'm still stuck on NES and like Super Nintendo. I haven't advanced. So is that it? Can you?
Oh, that's the thing. It's
Twitch?
a huge thing. Oh yeah. That's a massive thing. There's a huge retro gaming scene. Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Abby. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I appreciate you very much. Thanks for having me on.
Bye.
Hey, do you like movies? Do you like Serfs? Do you want movies and Serfs watching the movies? So then come over to the new channels. It's the Serfs Cinema. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Can you do the thing, that thumbs up and comment and all those things that help us out in the algorithm that controls every aspect of our lives? Also, if you happen to have a Facebook account, can you delete it? Like, just delete it. You should probably delete your Facebook account, because it's not a great company. But hey, if you can't do that for whatever reason, I understand. And could you also go to facebook.com/thesurftimes then and give us a little like and a follow. We're just trying to push back against the fact that people like Ben Shapiro happen to dominate the platform entirely. And when everyone asks why do older generations believe the things they believe, one of the problems is the majority of them on social media use Facebook. So to counter that, we're just going to be on there too now. Also, if you happen to have a union or a worker co-op or even a leftist project, podcast, website, Zoom, MySpace, it doesn't matter. We will advertise it for free on this channel. All you got to do is go to weareserfs.com and use the forms that we got there, weareserfs.com. Thanks, everybody.
To our God, Xander Corvus, we shall build ornate temples in your honor. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, and the Tim Caucus, we aim to be the best court jesters your money can buy. To our lords, Evan Nudie, Trevor R., Alexander Thaler, Ryan Lubin, Tofox, Jeff Lamb, Sint Forzi, We are your humble vassals, ready to till your land. To our Knights of the Round Table, Omni, Mr. Anderson, Riley and Anna, Ryan Craig, Multimondi, Trevor Janis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophoja, Saren 42, Chronic to Hemphog, The Great Houdini, Bowen Jenny, Catherine, Radical Maniac, Ramon Acosta, Jay Fraser Cartwright, Jimmy Bignuts, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Political Puppy, Andreas Chiringuito, Zach Christensen, Yopi, Josh Mickelson, Todd Buckingham, Todd Lajeunesse, Constance Joyce Lacheris. We raise our glass of mead and we salute you.